Welcome to Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast.
I'm David Pinsoff,
I'm David Pietrzewski.
and what are we even doing here?
That's a good question. Maybe we should have an episode about that.
Yeah, maybe.
But oh, I think you mean just like just approximately like what are we doing in people's ears?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay, that was confusing because there's a couple different ways. Okay, so yeah, no, we're recording a podcast that's about evolutionary psychology.
That's right. And it's not fake evolutionary psychology. It's actual evolutionary psychology by actual evolutionary psychologists.
That's right.
Okay, Dave, we have an awesome guest today.
We do.
What
Chris
is what?
Von Rueden, University
Yes.
of Richmond, Virginia, at the Jepson School of Leadership, and he studies the Tsimane in the Amazon, and he does really cool work understanding inequality and status. And this was just a really fun episode.
Yeah, this was a blast. He does awesome research, really great insights into status hierarchies, inequality. He also has an awesome name, Chris Von
Yeah.
Rueden. I wish I had a Von in my name, David Von Pinsoff. It sounds pretty epic.
You can always, you can change your name.
You think I should change it? All
Well,
right,
you
maybe.
published a lot of papers so far, so you'd have
Yeah,
to previously known as.
yeah. Okay, the
We can
artist
maybe we can just
previously known
start
as
referring
David
to this
Pinsoff.
as Von Pinsoff. Yeah, it might
All
be
right, that sounds
confusing with
good.
Von Ruden though, but we'll talk to Chris. We'll see what he thinks about
Yeah,
you changing your
we'll
name.
ask him. All right, without further ado, enjoy.
Enjoy Chris Von Ruden. Welcome, Chris Von Ruden. Good to see you. You are professor at the Jepson School of Leadership, University, excuse me, University of Richmond.
Mhm.
Um, Chris, how long have you been at Richmond now?
Uh, 2013 I arrived.
Okay.
So, as you know, I was at UCSB with you as a grad student. Um, but yeah, then I did a postdoc year or two. I think it was 2 years with Mike Gervin, st also at UCSB, and then on the job market at the time. And had a couple of hits, but the first offer I got was from this school, which was sort of like, well, what is this? Leadership studies. And it sort of worked out because I'm sort of a misfit anthropologist. I have my fingers in a lot of different pots and wear different hats. And this school is sort of like a gen ed within a gen ed.
Mm.
Um, uh,
What does that mean? Can you just explain that for people who might not know what that means? Like how is it different than a typical maybe anthropology or psychology department?
my direct boss is a dean, which is
Mm.
fantastic. And there's about 15 or so faculty. And I'm the only anthropologist. There are, there were like three psychologists. Now we just have one, two recently retired. Um, couple historians, four philosophers, couple political scientists, sociologist, English studies, religious studies person. So very diverse faculty, and it's geared around the understanding of leadership, not sort of training leaders per se, but understanding processes of leadership, social and political organization, social movement, social justice, ethical questions surrounding all those topics.
Cool.
Um,
Yeah, it
yeah,
sounds
It
great.
sounds like a cool program to be a part of. Are you the only explicitly Darwinian person who brings evolutionary ideas to the study of leadership, or are there others in that area as well?
explicitly Darwinian, very few and far between.
Okay,
Maybe like the closest person to me on the whole campus, so even beyond the leadership school, but University of Richmond broadly is a geneticist that studies ancient populations in Asia. Um, but that said, a couple of the psychologists I think who had hired me and now retired have collaborated with evolutionary psychologists, are interested in evolutionary psychology, and so that maybe I had while they are around, I had some shared interest with them. I mean, I have a lot of shared interest with a lot of people, but explicitly Darwinian theoretical focus, yeah, it's me.
Got it. And do you find that you get blank stares or hostility or confusion when you bring these ideas to bear, or is there more of an enthusiasm and interest in incorporating? What do you think is the vibe in terms of you being this ambassador from evolutionary theory?
I've had um, some discussions in some public fora on campus regarding different topics, gender and masculinity and other things, where I've just sort of, unabashedly expressed my views and theoretical perspectives, and it hasn't really raised any eyebrows, particularly with younger faculty. Maybe, with older faculty, I've gotten a sense sometime, not tremendously, that sort of, you know, my assumption is that they understand the sort of Darwinian perspective as somehow a genetic determinist kind of view
Right.
or something of that nature. And
Which would be do you, incorrect. I mean, do you try to disabuse them of that, or is the idea that you
mm,
can't have a conversation with everybody, and so you're just noticing that there's a cohort effect for how people understand science, and that the newer generation is a more sophisticated one?
I don't, sophisticated maybe, or just more charitable,
Mhm.
or uh, yeah, I don't know. I think especially among anthropologists and other social scientists, there's a lot of fear surrounding Darwinian perspectives in terms of its sort of assumed repercussions for policy, which
Mhm.
is not um, so I don't know. I always try with, especially with students. I mean, I don't get into too many conversations with faculty about rationale reasons for my theoretical views. But especially with students, I try to argue the ways in which taking a nature versus nurture approach is not tremendously useful outside of some limited domains like irritability or something, where you
Mhm.
can formalize it at a population level. But understanding the ways in which genes and environments construct, together who we are, and the role that understanding Darwinism as a uh, in helping us understand the ways genes and environments interact, often by design.
Mhm.
I mean, I try to portray that as sort of a middle ground that's fairly, neither genetically determinist nor sort of social constructivist.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I think even implicit in studying other cultures and going to somewhere else, right? I think that that is sort of acknowledged in there. We haven't really had a chance. We haven't, for example, had Annie Wirtz on yet to talk about development and nature nurture, why that's sort of a fallacy. We haven't actually covered that. It's still early days here. Um, what do you say to the students aside from what you just said, or is that about it with maybe an example?
well, I get into more detail about lots of examples of how, individual physiology and behavior reflects gene environment interactions. You know, um, I'll still use, I don't know if this is sort of out of favor these days, but Tubi and Cosmides sort of evoked and transmitted
Mhm.
distinction.
Could you, for those who aren't familiar with that distinction, could you give a quick recap of it?
Sure. So describing the sources of cultural variations or different average differences in behavior across groups or communities or societies. One source of that variation could be what they call evoked culture. So the ways in which environments, social ecological environments evoke differences in behavior akin to the way that moving from shade to the sun might evoke changes in skin pigmentation over a period of time, by
Mhm.
design. And so the argument is that, for example, average differences in physical aggressiveness or trust or other sort of psychological phenomena vary in response by design to differences in the sort of demographics or ecology of a society or community. Um, Sex ratio, for example, and the way that can shift mating behavior or
Mhm.
use of mating competition tactics. And
Mhm.
it's not, importantly, it's not necessarily, or, in contrast with so-called transmitted culture, not a product of social learning, but it's just the way our minds produce generate behavior in response to particular environments.
Mhm.
Um,
Right. And the idea, I think, just to fill in, is that
mhm,
you need to understand both the cultural situation and then also the design in the mind to understand the eventual phenomenon or the output, because
mhm,
the output is not just a function of the content of what's being told to people. So if you want to predict it, understand it, change it, understand where it's going to go, where it's coming from. You have to understand both the design and the phenotype and the inputs to the system, and both can be a lot more complicated than maybe either historically our sides have seen. So even this view might argue that the social context is very complicated, lots of cues. It might even be different than what's intuitive, right? It might be something like, what's the local level of trust? Like, Chris, I'm looking forward to talking to you about egalitarianism and those inputs and what that design is. Um, but but yeah, is that fair, Chris? Like, do you think that's a fair
Yeah.
characterization?
And I especially like how you tacked on to prediction to that too. I mean, this is, we should be able to predict changes in behaviors as environments shift. Um, so yeah, I forget his name. Who's done the work? He's done work in East Asia with respect to rice versus wheat growing. Thomas Talhelm. That kind
Mhm.
of, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, showing how historical exposure to different forms of production, food production, that demands different kinds of cooperation and collective action, may be in part or good part responsible for variation in collectivist kind of norms um, within and across societies. So that's the kind of sort of socio-ecological explanation for cultural phenomena that I'm really drawn to as primarily trained as a behavioral ecologist,
Mhm.
um, a sort of sub area within evolutionary anthropology. And it's
Yeah,
not to discount like social transmission, but I can see social transmission has force in its own right, but it often
So,
can
so,
complement. Yeah.
so we went over the evoked culture,
Mm,
the idea that, a response to a particular aspect of the environment, a strategic response to a particular aspect of the environment, uh, that itself is an adaptation, a form of evolved design that we can talk about and study scientifically. But there's the other distinction that we didn't get to yet, which is transmitted culture. So this is different from evoked culture, and that the strategic response to the environment is not what we're talking about. We're talking about something else. So what are we talking about when it comes to transmitted culture?
right. So this is differences in behavior, values, norms across societies,
Hmm.
populations based on the social learning.
Hmm.
So what you've acquired from others through either observation or direct social learning, um, teaching, instruction, etc. And
Hmm.
those, can generate cultural dynamics that are unpredictable based on this sort of socio-ecology, what you might be able to predict from just an evoked culture perspective or behavioral ecology perspective for that matter. Although,
Hmm.
the argument is that cultural norms, institutions, one factor in their emergence will be the socioecology that will
Hmm.
shape the kinds of norms and institutions we create. That doesn't fully determine them, but influences them. Um,
yeah. There's a nice example of somebody. I apologies to whoever class of people's work this is because I'm forgetting who it was. But I know there's a bunch of people who have argued that if you just look at climate and or crops, the correlation between bad climate for growing crops and warfare is
mm,
enormous historically. And so it's this idea that, the transmitted cultural idea of we should go attack some people is sort of always there, but
mm,
that doesn't on its own sufficiently predict when warfare ratchets up. But the idea is that when there's
mm,
hardship, or when you're starting to get hungry and resources get scarce, that changes the marketplace of ideas and how appealing
mm.
it is to go, oh, let's get their stuff. Changes when the climate gets worse, and so that would be a nice
Interesting.
example of that.
Mhm. Yeah, the
Hmm.
synergy between them. But I think there's also lots of evidence of cases where the culture persists after the environment shifts and is
Hmm.
sustained by that transmitted cultural mechanisms. Um,
Hmm.
a lot of, like the Thomas Stahlhelm work again, where people that are long distant from sort of agricultural production, living in urban areas, maintain these sort of norms from their sort of ancestral region where they came from in, say, parts of China, um, or work on sort of the effects of colonialism in West Africa by Nunn that had this long-lasting effects. Um, so yeah, evoked, transmitted. They have synergistic effects, but they can operate independent of each other.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think
So the
also they'll
idea,
miss. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, so the idea there is that a strategic response to a particular aspect of the environment, like when food is scarce, go to war and get the stuff from the other tribe. When you need to cooperate more to get food, like with, rice farming, then upregulate your cooperation motivations. These kinds of strategic responses emerge in response emerge in tandem with environmental changes, but they can lag. They can persist past the point when they were originally useful, such that,
Mhm.
people whose ancestors were rice farmers will still be more cooperative today, even though, rice farming was, a couple hundred years ago. So the idea is that evoked culture explains the initial response to the environment, but transmitted culture explains the lag, why it persists in populations past the point from which it was useful. Is that the idea?
Yeah, that's well said.
Okay.
I think also transmitted culture can uh, generate sort of de novo kinds of practices and things
Hmm.
that independent of the socioecology. So aren't
Hmm.
necessarily just created via sociological factors to begin with. And that's where I think your use of the word strategic, you can interpret in two ways.
Hmm.
One is
Hmm.
strategic in the sense of evoke culture, where it's sort of evolution did the strategy making or
Hmm.
strategizing. And
Yeah.
then there's also sort of the individual agency where our ability to sort of think about potential outcomes, potential technologies, potential norms,
Yeah.
counterfactually. Um, and that can be a potent source of what becomes a cultural transmission to the extent those certain people are more influential than others in getting
Hmm.
groups to adopt their ideas.
Yeah, I think technology would be a good example. We're going to have Christina Moy on in a few
Mm.
episodes. She was part of the Rob Boyd group of people, and Christina was really influential for me for realizing I'm an adaptationist, not usually thinking about the importance of transmitted culture. And I think the idea, like the Rob Boyd idea of like canoes, right, where or
Mm.
kayaks, where it's individual sort of trial and error. Like you want to stay dry and you want to move quickly over water, right? And there's just certain like trial and error stuff either within an individual or across individuals. But, hunting success, staying dry, staying warm, getting a seal or whatever you're hunting, fishing, that is sort of a trial and error dynamic that selects for kayak or canoe design that may be better than certainly better than like what quote unquote you would have innately in your mind. Like we don't have a canoe or kayak building template in our mind. It might be
Mhm.
better than what any person can do, right? Like we all know of intergenerational transmission of, the way yeah, airplanes, the first generation of airplanes, the design is actually pretty similar to the Wright brothers did pretty well. But, the constant tweaks, when I fly, it's not like Wilbur and Orville were flying, right? It's quite different. Um, and this idea that all of that trial and error accumulation of design in an artifact or technology is a different way to explain how emerging complexity, or like the phenotypic, the extended phenotype in Dawkins terms, right? Like where does that canoe or kayak design come from? The idea that it transmitted culture, and that's an important thing to understand if you want to understand how does a canoe end up like that. Like I think Christina and Rob, I'm convinced by that that's a really important thing to understand. It's all made possible by the evoked psychology and by the evolved phenotype, but it's in addition on top of that.
And that last point I think is important because being a graduate student at UCSB and it had front stage to sort of ongoing battles between the sort of evolutionary psychology emphasis on psychological adaptation, specific psychological adaptation, and the sort of UC Davis, UCLA emphasis on social learning and cultural, uh, phenomena more generally, sort of broad-based learning. But yet the two are quite compatible.
Mm.
In
Mhm.
fact, require each other, in my view, in a lot of ways. One person who I've liked who's created some synergy, I think, between them and also really centered sort of individual agency and counterfactual thinking and is Manveer Singh.
Mm.
Some of
Mhm.
his broader pieces on culture.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, we'll have to
Yeah,
have
no.
Manvi around. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to have.
right.
He does great stuff. I mean, the idea that he's interested in is to what extent culture is shaped by the self-interested motivations of the producers of
Hmm.
the culture in terms of the benefits they might receive either from status or by trying to shape a social norm that might benefit them. These kinds of
Right.
bringing the individual agent into the equation of culture, I think, is a really insightful way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, Chris, one before we move on, let's who are you and what are you doing here? Let's do a little because I don't think we've had any Chimane folks on yet. So can you tell us a little bit about what you study and who your study population is? And yeah.
Sure. So I did my graduate work at Santa Barbara with Michael Gervin, who had recently started a large project with a group of people in Bolivian Amazon called the Chimane, with Hillard Kaplan, who was at New Mexico. He's now at Chapman in California. And the two had just started this large sort of medical demography project to understand human life history and aging with the Chimane. And as part of this project, they were bringing on PhDs and postdocs in anthropology to go to communities, Chimane communities, and study sort of people's social behavior, social relationships, as it relates to demography, longevity, aging. Um, since that project had grown leaps and bounds, um, knock on wood, it's been well funded by NIH, and has generated incredible insights into how things we might assume about human health and aging, based on a lot of research with Western developed populations, is not universal, and there's much we learn about the diseases of so-called civilization from studying and working with people like the Chimane.
Hmm. What are some of the things we've learned?
So the relative absence of cardiovascular disease,
Hmm.
um, asthmas, autoimmune disorders, and that there's people live to late age.
Hmm.
Now there's a lot of mortality, but it's not driven by those cardiovascular diseases or cancers to the degree it is in other more developed populations.
Hmm. So
Um,
this is this is a common misconception I hear that people think that in ancestral times people didn't live much past 30 or whatever. This is a
mhm.
very common misconception. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but part of the reason this misconception arises is because if we're looking at average mortality, that doesn't take into account at what age the person dies. So it could be if you have a high
Mhm.
child mortality rate, that could bring the average mortality down to a pretty low number, even if people are if they make it past childhood, living to a quite old age. Is that how you think about it?
That's exactly how I think about it.
Okay.
High childhood mortality will bring that average way down.
Hmm.
I think there's higher age specific mortality, across the lifespan in these populations, but still there are people living to their 80s, 90s even. Um, Now, a lot of small scale societies like the Chimane that have been studied recently aren't, this is probably a good point to make for a lot of other things we might discuss. They aren't like, living fossils, so to speak. But the sort of ecology and demography and aspects of their life help us better reconstruct the past than if we say only studied people in larger scale developed societies. So I think
Yeah.
I mean, that's an important point to make that there are, the Chimane have our interaction with the state level society, have variable exposure to modern medicine, although fairly limited. Um, they also are horticulturalists, so they do a lot of foraging, but some of the food they do produce through gardening.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, can
So
you
I want
talk
to,
a
I want
little
to, I want
bit?
to,
Oh,
oh,
sorry, David.
I wanted to briefly get into this cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disease point that you make, because I think this is something that will probably be of interest to our listeners, and then we can, once we move past this, we can get onto more interesting topics in evolutionary psychology. But this idea that these diseases are problems of the modern world, and they're not necessarily ancestral diseases. So, is the
mhm.
idea there that there's something about the modern diet, our consumption of mass-produced foods that is causing higher rates of cardiovascular disease? Is it something about our hygienic practices that increase the prevalence of autoimmune disease? What is the story here?
I mean, the simple story is diet and
Okay.
exercise.
Hmm.
Um, and the more interesting story involves a couple other things. I think the first thing is I know there's really interesting work by Herman Poncer
Hmm.
and others in collaboration with some people that have worked with the Chimane that implicate diet much more so than exercise in the sort of obesity, cardiovascular issues
Hmm.
in the civilized world. Not civilized per se, no, but modern developed societies.
Sure.
Um, and based on interesting work with so-called doubly labeled water, where you can look at metabolism um, and compare rates of energetic expenditure across populations. And yeah, a lot of things point to diet as being a potential or a larger player than necessarily exercise.
Hmm.
But both the Chimane seem to do better on in terms of uh, healthier diet, much more exercise per day. But the other interesting thing is the potential role of the so-called hygiene hypothesis
Hmm.
or friendly friends or old friends, or I don't know what the forget the moniker there is, but certain kinds of worms that our immune systems evolved to anticipate and without exposure to misfire or overfire with respect to minor issues and generates more frequent, constant kind of inflammation, autoimmune
Hmm.
issues. And so there's some level of pathogen exposure, particular kinds of pathogen exposures to certain kinds of worms, especially that um, may have protective effects in terms of cardiovascular disease and autoimmune disorders,
Hmm.
um, while also having significant costs too, in terms of anemia
Right.
and other kind of effects on your body over as you age.
Right. So before people don't rush out and start, asking their kids to go roll around in the mud and eat garbage, you're saying that there is a trade-off here, where yes, we have greater medical and hygienic practices that reduce the incidence of pathogens during childhood, and one of the prices we pay for that is a greater prevalence of autoimmune diseases in late age. But it's a price worth paying because it reduces the incidence of childhood mortality that is much higher in these societies.
And, and also it contributes to mortality over later ages too.
Yeah.
Um, I think respiratory infections though are is maybe the biggest source of mortality for the Chimane, but
Hmm.
Mhm.
uh,
Why is that? They're not working in factories.
oh, pneumonias and
Mm,
other things, and if you're not getting access to antibiotics or other
right,
things regulated.
right. Yeah. Can you
Uh,
talk a little bit? Because I mean, I think people may not know at all what Chimane, what a village is like, or when you go to the field. Can you just sort of walk us through like what is the level of access like? I mean, yeah.
Part of the reason that they became such a focus of study, and perhaps at this point, the most well-studied traditional smaller scale society on the planet in terms
Mm,
of number of people and research groups that have worked with them in the past couple decades. But their avoided missionization early on in the sort of 17th, 18th centuries said, no thanks, retreated further into forest. Um, and it was also there in a part of the Bolivian Amazon that wasn't, I guess, that lucrative in terms of rubber trade and other resource extraction. And so escaped a lot of the sort of slavery, basically, that a lot of indigenous groups experienced as part of the rubber boom and in the 19th century. And then it wasn't until the 20th century, late 20th century, that roads were built to the region from La Paz, the capital of Bolivia. And that sort of opened up migration to the area and renewed missionization attempts by Catholics and evangelicals. And evangelicals were successful because they brought with them primary schools, a health clinic, built a radio station for the Tsimane. They also started the first sort of Tsimane council, a sort of representative body of the Tsimane, and this was in the late 80s, early 90s. The Tsimane had previously, no formal sort of political organization, whether within or between communities. They were and still to some extent are fairly mobile across communities. They'll move. Their social life is concentrated around extended families in which cooperation and production are concentrated. And extended families will congregate in communities, but then will also move to other communities where they might have relatives or now, more recently, communities have become much more sort of a political entity. They're formally recognized, and people are part of this community or that community, and you'll have like soccer teams from one community or another. And now most communities have primary schools, some have secondary schools, that really cements a greater sort of sedentism within particular communities. There are Tsimane families that have become more urban dwelling and live in the sort of local market town called San Borja. Um, and most Tsimane now earn wage labor from various sources, participation in logging activities or working for ranchers and almost all Tsimane make money selling horticultural goods in the market town. But all this change has been fairly rapid since really the introduction of roads in the 1970s. So a lot of their traditional ways of life have been fairly well preserved. Almost everybody still speaks their language. I mean, that's starting to change, but that's been the case.
Mhm.
Um, and
And they're
one thing,
hunter horticulturalists, how would you characterize their subsistence or?
like 65% or so of their food calories comes from horticulture. So
Mm,
growing
Hmm.
rice, banana, yucca. It's like an underground starch, like a potato-like thing. Um, and about 30, most of the remainder comes from hunting and gathering. So they do a lot of fishing. So a lot of fish in their diet. They also hunt wild game in the forest. Um, and so they're, horticultural foragers, if you will. I'd emphasize more the horticulture, more calories comes from horticulture. It's not, they don't use much technology in their horticulture, sort of why we distinguish it from agriculture, as agriculture being more tool intensive, often using domesticated animals,
Mhm.
plows, that kind of thing.
it's a pretty
Uh,
riverine. Is it like a lot of transportation historically was canoes? Is that correct? Like,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. So the river is the heart of the Tsimane society, traveling up to visit other communities. Um, so yeah.
Chris,
Uh,
this might be apocryphal, and we can cut this if it turns out I completely confabulated this. But
mhm.
I think you were the person, and if it wasn't me, you, I'm sorry. But you told me, I think you were a couple days upriver, which is the expression, for like how far into the jungle you are and how far away from public transportation. And am I making this up that somebody told you that like Michael Jackson had died and you realize, so can you tell me the story again? Okay, you're shaking your head yes, so I'm really glad I didn't make it up. Can you
I
please
see.
tell
Yeah, I
me
see.
what the story?
It made an impact. I see.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, can you so fill it in? Yeah, please fill it in. Yeah.
Uh, this is in a fairly remote community, and it's not like information or news gets there pretty quickly. And I had been in that community for only about a week. And like I said, it took me a couple of days to get there on a canoe from the market town, San Borja. And somebody says to me, "Oh, hey, do you know Michael Jackson died?" And first of all, I'm like, "You know Michael Jackson? That's awesome." But secondly, no, he didn't die. Like, yeah, this is one of those things you just. But it turns out he had died subsequent to my leaving in the canoe for this community. And this guy had got word of it. This was about a week after I'd left, just through word of mouth, people coming and going. And so, the world is
Yeah.
small, is the lesson.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a beautiful thing, right? Like, so there's this guy who's like, 2 days upriver or something,
Mhm.
maybe not exactly, but it was clearly just through word of mouth transmission that this got to him.
They're informing you of developments in Western culture that you
Exactly.
weren't aware of.
Exactly.
That's very funny.
So yeah, but I've been working with the Chimane since 2005.
Mm,
Um,
yeah. And when you go, we had Sheena Lulevi on, who worked with the Bayaka and in central Congo. When you go, what are the conditions like? Are you living in a yeah, like, from like lavish hotel to I don't know, what's the minimal thing? Like what is it like when you're there?
um, Typically, when I'm going to communities, I'm in a tent. Occasionally, I've been in a tent inside a hut, so
Mm,
added layer of protection from the elements. Um, and then I'll bring canned food and pasta and things like that with me. I'll trade sugar and salt and fish hooks and other things for like meat sometimes and other things, vegetables. Um, but yeah, not hotel.
yeah.
And it's nice to sort of when I've been there to sort of live with the by the sunset and sunrise in a lot of ways. So I
Mm.
get up earlier, I go to bed earlier. Um,
Do
in
you
part
miss it?
because you
Do you miss it when you're not there? Or is it, yeah.
there are the things I miss are like this things like the stars. They're amazing.
Mm.
Or just having, especially this one community I've visited the most, getting to know people and going back and seeing them and how they're doing, catching up is always really enjoyable. I think as I get older, tenting it out and the humidity and the insects, it sort of, wears on me more.
Yeah, I also imagine
Uh,
once you're a parent, we're all three of us are parents, it's harder to be away too.
oh yeah. In fact, the most recent trip I did research related was in Namibia. I was a little better living conditions. Um, so I haven't been to Bolivia actually since the beginning of COVID.
Mm,
So it's been several years.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And I mean, one of the things, and you can tell me more about this, is like, obviously anthropology, there's sort of a history of colonialism and, or
Mhm.
extraction, capitalists, like, or missionaries coming in. And within even anthropology, my understanding is there's been a real change from us, coming in as opposed in changing that to something more where the research is also done by the people in the community as well, and it's a
Mhm.
much more of a collaboration as well. Has that happened in the Chimane land?
So the just in terms of reciprocity, which I think is important, that the larger medical project we had been discussing, is
Mm,
providing free medical care to the majority of the Chimane, which is insane. But that's sort of in order to generate the data that the project is studying. It's part of the what you need to do, but it's also provides benefits.
yeah.
In my own personal work, where I've veered off into studying social hierarchy and collective action and leadership, um, I always work with the communities I'm in to discuss my ideas and inevitably tweak or change the way I'm asking things or doing things. Um,
So
and
you discuss the research project and your research interests and the questions you're interested in with the people you're studying.
Yeah, I'll do focus groups where say, hey, this is something I'm going to be asking, or this is a topic I'm going to be getting into. What do you think about this or that? And they'll give me feedback.
Hmm.
Like if I'm
Are,
asking about conflicts, right?
yeah.
There's ways to ask about it that will elicit better responses than other ways of asking. And
Mm,
if you just
Huh.
jump into your study, you won't get it right, and you might get less
Interesting.
quality information.
Are they at all like hostile or turned off? Like, because if someone was, approaching me in my community and saying, "I want to understand the social hierarchy, who's at the top and who's at the bottom in your group," I would be like very uncomfortable by them doing that. Or it's
Yeah.
like, I want to just, I want to learn about, who's in conflict with whom and what the different, squabbles are in your friend group. Like, I would be a little reluctant to share that information with them. I'd be like, "Why? Who are you? Why do you want this information?" So, is there any of that kind of response when you discuss this with them?
Yeah, and I was very prepared to meet with a little success there on that basis. On
Hmm.
the other hand, I had an inkling before I really jumped into that particular area of work. I was doing other things with the Tsimane for months before digging into social hierarchy, social relationships. Um, the that just common public conversations often centered around people's reputations,
Hmm.
um, in front of the people that are being discussed, and it just seemed
Hmm.
very people seem to be very comfortable discussing you know status related topics in general, just in
Really?
daily life.
Really?
Um, yeah, I think so.
Interesting. Do you
Yeah.
find that that is a difference between between the cultures you study and say Western cultures? Is there more of a comfort with
Mhm.
being overt and explicit about status relationships in the Tsimane than among say Western cultures?
There's first of all, there's the cultural differences, but there's also just this factor of living in smaller communities, where you're interacting with and know about the goings on of the people living around you,
Hmm.
fairly intimately, in ways that, like here in my house, I don't know so much about what my neighbors are doing on a day-to-day basis. And so the former, I think, creates a, you know, sometimes out of just the reality is you observing and listening to what's happening around you. And so everybody just knows things. And also people gather and discuss what's going on more frequently as communities. Um, I think also this might relate to our discussion of egalitarianism, but people are uh, very sort of, not, they don't defer to authority per se or to individual attempts to gain influence, but will laugh at it or will, you know, point out grievances quite readily, um, just in common conversation. Now, to get angry is different. That's sort of not seen as appropriate, but these topics I think are common. Now, they're maybe not common for somebody who just walks into the community, but also if you've been there a little while, these are frequent topics of
Y-
conversation.
You're not a stranger anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Not wanting to be coerced, having autonomy, and egalitarianism. These were all things that you recently
Mhm.
gave a talk, and I was listening to it. I thought it was amazing. And I know Lita was suggesting you should write a book about egalitarianism. um, because I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, or you can sort of do a better job of summarizing what your perspective is, but you've been doing this long enough that you've sort of, it seems like you've wrapped your head around this thing of egalitarianism. What is it? Why does it exist?
Mhm.
And what kind of thing is it a product of? And is it a good or bad thing? And it's a bit more complicated and nuanced than maybe the sort of superficial thing would be sort of like, well, we currently live in a great income inequality, and obviously
Mhm.
there are examples of that that are horrible, like rich people who don't need their money who are buying, $50,000 baseball caps, and like there's kids dying
Mhm.
because they can't get medicine. Like nobody thinks that's good, or I hope most people don't think that's good. But but there are but there's so that's we can put that aside. But then there's this flip side of like a place where there's very little inequality. People I think sometimes think that sounds really good too. And I think you've
Mhm.
looked at this continuum, and had thoughts about it. I'm just curious, sort of. I don't have a specific question, but this is just sort of pushing us over into that egalitarian thing you've been thinking about. And I don't
Mhm.
have a good articulate way to put it, but yeah, please help me.
No, I think you frame things that we live in hierarchy, or we live in societies with very pronounced hierarchies based on material wealth. And I think, especially as there's more political and general societal attention to levels of inequality, wealth and income inequality, there's inevitably people saying, "Hey, look, human ancestors lived in more egalitarian kinds of societies. You know, why can't we just rekindle those kind of sentiments,
Hmm.
values, etc. Um, and and that or even arguments that humans are sort of intrinsically pro-social, altruistic, other regarding,
Hmm.
inequality averse, right? And
Hmm.
based upon our long evolution in presumably more egalitarian, smaller scale societies. And
Hmm.
so we have the right motivations. We just gotta sort of push people in the right direction for us to
Yeah.
realize those
We've been
things.
corrupted by civilization and capitalism and agriculture, all, that narrative that we
Yes,
used to be,
yes.
peaceful and harmonious, and
Yeah.
that all changed. Yeah.
So I think that that sort of noble savage trope gets resurrected all the time.
Hmm.
It's age-old philosophers, Rousseau, Montaigne, to the present day continue to evoke this idea of the sort of noble savage egalitarianism and altruism and was our sort of natural state.
Hmm.
You see it in movies um, like Avatar and what have you.
Hmm.
Um, but I think most anthropologists, if not all anthropologists, would argue that the reality is much more complicated. There's interesting variation across smaller scale societies. That egalitarianism is not what you think it is. Um, and so that talk you mentioned, Dave, that I gave, is not me sort of like, introducing these revelations to
Right.
anthropology, but rather just reflecting what people have long known. But yet this, I think, especially outside anthropology, in particular in media and in certain places of academia, but not everywhere, that noble savage idea continues to rear its head. Um, and a lot of my work that was focused on um, status and reputation and leadership and hierarchy, both my work with the Tsimane and my reading of ethnographies and of other smaller scale societies suggested to me that people are people, and that yes, there are societies that are more and less egalitarian, but those are, there's not any massive qualitative differences in human society with respect to things like status motives or motives for why we cooperate, or that the environments can shape and influence those motives, can in interesting ways. They can result in either more dampened inequalities or very heightened ones. Um, so. So yeah, my own personal work and my understanding of broader ethnographic work on smaller scale societies has made the seem like it'd be important to do something regarding general kind of article, if not a book, for Lita's suggestion on egalitarianism. Um, and I've been working on this project recently with somebody who works for the Hadza, who are one of the last remaining, full-time hunter-gatherers, at least a good segment of their population still in Tanzania. His name is Duncan Stibbert Hawks. Um, So that's been a great partnership to discuss egalitarianism and our joint knowledge of various ethnographies and basically we've been trying to answer two questions. One is just how egalitarian are various societies in terms of outcomes with respect to social capital, leadership, gender, ritual status, reproduction, and then secondly, irrespective of the level of inequality in those things, just how egalitarian in motive are members of these societies.
Hmm.
Versus could you get relatively less inequality, in these societies via more selfish motives as well.
That's a really important distinction. So there's a difference between the levels of equality or inequality you see in terms of outcomes, like who's getting the resources, who's reproducing more than whom. And there's
Mhm.
also variation in terms of people's motives. So it could be that everyone has really hierarchical motivations, that they're really motivated to get status and maintain status, but they're just blocked by various
Mhm.
forces. Maybe people just gang up on them whenever they try to gain sufficient status over other people. And so the motive is still there, but the outcomes might not be there. Is that what you're
Right,
getting at?
right. And the motives for status can also produce a lot of generosity too.
Hmm. Yes.
Not just sort of, self-aggrandizing overtly through aggression or whatever, but other ways that have the effect of actually leveling other kinds of inequality while boosting your own reputation.
Mm, yeah, interesting. So there's this popular idea pioneered by Christopher Bem, this idea of a reverse dominance hierarchy. So the
Mhm.
narrative there is that other primates have these linear dominance hierarchies where, the alpha at the top picks on, exploits, bullies those at the bottom. And in humans, this changed. This sort of flipped on its head. So an alpha could no longer monopolize resources and mates because coalitions of betas and gammas would team up to take down the alpha. And so instead of a normal dominance hierarchy, what you had is a reverse dominance hierarchy where those who were displaying the most domineering behaviors or attempting to monopolize resources would in fact sink to the bottom of the hierarchy because all of the other members of the society would gang up on them and bully them. So I see this narrative a lot. Bem's work is very popular. Do you buy this narrative, or would you challenge parts of it? How do you think about this?
Yeah, thanks for asking because Bohm, I love his work. He was been a huge influence on
I'm
me.
sorry, did I miss? Is it Bohm? Is that how it's pronounced?
I actually don't know.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
Yeah.
I've never met him in person.
Okay.
I've heard it, but I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. Maybe
but you could be right.
regardless.
I can't even. I mean, I have like three pronunciations for my last name, so yeah, who
Yeah,
knows?
who knows? Bem
But
Bohm. Anyway.
I liked a lot his work too. He did work with human populations and with primates, and he synthesized a lot of that work into this really novel arguments about status hierarchy and inequality and human motivations regarding status.
Hmm.
And so that concept of reverse dominance hierarchy, yeah, really resonates with me. Um, Although I think the extent to which dominance is reversed, like those who would just bully others, are pushed down
Hmm.
by coalition of group members. It's I think there's been modeling work supporting this idea by Sergei Gavrilets and others that individuals are motivated to intercede to prevent bullying because of the
Hmm.
benefits to themselves of either avoiding future bullying or being in a group that does not have resources controlled by bullies.
Hmm.
Um, and so very much I think that's there's across a lot of smaller scale societies, you see these normative emphases on humility and you see a constant kind of mockery of those that try and act with bravado,
Hmm.
um, to the point of, as Bohm has cataloged, sometimes expulsion from the group or even death.
Hmm.
Um, Hopefully, we can talk a bit about gender here, but often a lot of the individuals responsible for calling out bravado are women uh, towards men. I can think of this, great example of this one individual was expelled from his camp. This might have been the Mbuti Central African foragers. This women wanted him out of the community because he was hunting too much, right? And so that's an example not of, and I mentioned that because it's an example not of dominance per se, but of too overt an attempt to gain prestige. And this is
Hmm.
this is where
He
I
was
think
being a
where
show
Bohm is
off.
locking.
Is that the
Yeah.
idea? He was showing off and being braggadocious about his
Yep.
hunting ability. That's interesting.
Yeah. So that's
Huh.
where I think Bohm's reverse dominance hierarchy is I like, but also I think it misses that prestige is this alternative. Some would argue that dichotomy is oversold, but um, you know, developing a reputation for benefiting others as an avenue to status does mean that there are hierarchies not based entirely on dominance that can emerge. Um, but even prestige too is seen as a means of gaining status has its limits.
Hmm.
And like that example.
That's fascinating. I mean, I continue to be fascinated by this paradoxical nature of status, and I'm
Mhm.
continuing to, I'm working on a theoretical paper on this. But this idea that often the best way to achieve dominance is to rebel against dominance, or at least create the narrative that that is
Mm.
what one is attempting to do. So if you gang up on a dominant, would-be alpha, what you are doing is dominating that alpha, and you are doing the thing that you are apparently rebelling against. The same thing goes with this, norms promoting humility. If humility gets me status, then there's something kind of paradoxical about that, where
Right.
displaying my humility, in fact, makes me look better than other people. And
Mhm.
so,
Yeah.
because we have to compete for status within this system of norms where overt status seeking is itself socially costly, it can lower our status. It creates a kind of volatility to our norms, such that once we all gain common knowledge of the fact that we're seeking status, or that one particular individual is seeking status, it sort of rearranges the social hierarchy such that those who are most aggressively seeking status will now sink to the bottom, or at least will get lowered. I'm curious what you think about this idea that the paradoxical nature of status hierarchy makes it kind of volatile and might generate, cultural variation in status symbols. Do you buy that idea? Do you think that's crazy, or is there something there?
No, I've liked your writing. That's sort of the
Mm,
nuance you bring to these topics or
mm,
novel ideas with regard
mm,
to the sort of signaling
yeah.
or anti-signaling, et cetera, involved in status competition.
Hmm.
Yeah, that you know, you got to be humble but not too humble.
Hmm.
You got to be a good hunter but not too good.
Hmm.
Generous but not too generous.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, there's this, but that sweet spot varies from society to society, and
Yeah.
the what you use to generate prestige varies from society to society, obviously. And um, so I think in these more egalitarian societies, where there's not a lot of wealth to accrue, people are very interdependent, um, that and displaying generosity, willingness to help others, is very key to people's survival and reproduction. That, of course, that's a huge contributor then to prestige, but to the extent you're overly generous, it's showing that maybe, oh, you think you're too good for the rest of us and don't need us.
Mm.
Um, and so that then becomes a negative. Uh,
Interesting.
so yeah, there's this famous, the paradigmatic example of the status loving is called the meat fight.
Hmm.
Richard Lee was this researcher of the Kung hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari, and for it was Christmas, and he said, this is what I celebrate, and he wanted to buy an ox for the community,
Yeah.
and he was told that it was disgusting, kind of gangrenous, whatever they said. We wouldn't touch it because it was too generous, too presumptive, and it would in
Mm.
fact that level of generosity is creates a form of debt that's unpayable. Um,
Mm.
People are interdependent, require others' aid, and but it's if you can't reciprocate, then you're just indebted, and that creates a situation that people don't like. That it's um, limits their autonomy, which is, I think that's an sort of a motive in addition to status that's central to egalitarianism. And I think human behavior generally.
The actually I'm working on a
Yeah.
paper called The Evolution of Autonomy.
Yeah.
And Chris, we should talk about it. And I think, one question then is, have people just been wrong about sort of the underlying principle or the North Star of human nature, that it's not
Mhm.
actually about egalitarian outcomes per se, but it's more of this combination of, I want a reasonable enough amount of status. I want autonomy. I don't want to be coerced. And
Mhm.
then you combine that with something like just reasonable welfare trade-offs. Like you said, you have a better idea when you're with the Tsimane, what's going on with the neighbors. The
Mhm.
scenario where you have more than enough to eat and a neighbor's kid is dying of starvation just wouldn't happen, right? In that kind of community, because if you put
Mhm.
a normal human who's not impaired in that kind of environmental ecology, who's getting the cues of that, that just doesn't, that's not going to happen. You're going to say, okay, of course, I'm going to give him food.
Mhm.
So I kind of wonder sometimes if the motivation behind people wanting the noble savage thing, the sort of thing that there's something I'm missing or it would be better. I wonder if it's just the inability to articulate maybe something like it's not just the equal outcomes, but there's something about, the structure of modern life that prevents or conversely enables terrible things like kids starving to death when there's more than enough food.
Yeah. So part of my interest is understanding egalitarianism, but then also I'm interested in, given my work with communities like the Chimane that have been undergoing change as they are more and more exposed to the market economy, and why people come to tolerate inequality
Mm,
then, right? If it infringes on an individual autonomy, um, or generates, debt relationships and other, you know, uh, um, and I think there's a lot of different answers, but in traditional smaller scale, like more egalitarian societies, often people are highly interdependent of each other and have minimal means of buffering risk other than investment in social relationships. So lack of private wealth or insurance to buffer risk is one arguably key reason why inequalities are remain low.
So the idea
uh,
there is without a health insurance company, say, or a social safety net, I have to mitigate the winds of fortune. The if I come up short hunting one day, if there's a famine, there's a natural disaster, there's a flood,
mhm,
shit happens, and I need some way to insure against that. And if I don't have an insurance company to insure me against those catastrophic risks, then I need some other way to insure myself. And so the reasoning is that we form cooperative networks where we all agree to help each other should someone suffer misfortune, and that is
mhm.
mutually beneficial for all of us. Uh, is that sort of the logic there?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Dave was mentioning the kid that's starving. What's the
Mhm.
problem?
Yeah.
Your kid will be starving in a week because
Hmm.
you didn't get
Exactly.
food.
Yeah.
Um, now that's not to say that there aren't average differences in, say, productivity and
Yeah.
ability to produce
Hmm.
food. And if you're in a hunter-gatherer society, right, or um,
Right.
and more mobile hunter-gatherer society, there are some we haven't discussed. Is there are hunter-gatherers that have formal coercive hierarchies, but that's a whole other story.
Right.
But in the more egalitarian mobile foragers, yeah, there is variation in productive ability and skill, and but the best hunters still come home days without food or get sick and injured, and
Hmm.
um, so it's gaining a reputation for generosity is important, such that when you need it, you yourself are helped, right?
Mm.
And it also matters in that in other domains like gaining social allies or being preferred as a mate, also, you benefit from being generous in those ways,
Yeah.
um, such that the levels of reproductive inequalities in sort of realized surviving offspring variation across individuals in even more egalitarian foragers is not that different from societies with more wealth, agricultural societies, so based on some work I did. So,
Mm.
um, but um, yeah, but there's also, people are enmeshed in this web of cooperation, but it's not just sort of based on pure altruism or necessarily inequality aversion, but based on sort of risk minimization,
Hmm.
um, or avoiding a reputation for stinginess that will come back to hurt you in the future.
Yeah.
Um, or there are models that have been called tolerated scrounging, where like if you happen to have a lot at one time, there's less and less motive for you in keeping everything you have as others demand it. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, and all these are reasons why we sort of, you know, there's not strong evidence that individuals in these societies are sort of intrinsically inequality averse, and but
Right.
rather do so for these motives that ultimately have benefits for them, through giving,
Right.
sharing,
Right.
leveling the status of others.
right. So the
Right.
idea would
Reducing.
be,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, David.
Go
So just
ahead.
the idea would be that, and one of the themes of this has been sort of being s- shutting up for a second and letting the data speak for itself.
Hmm.
Or like what's true, the adaptations. And so the
Yeah.
idea would be that it's not that in egalitarian societies, I'm just saying what you've already said, but it's not that there's some intrinsic motivation that's angelic per se, but it's that even when I'm helping this starving kid, I mean, obviously
Mhm.
that's a good thing, and I'm motivated intrinsically to do that. But if we want more of that to happen in a large
Mhm.
scale social world, we should not um, think that attributing a very altruistic motivation, as warm and fuzzy as that feels, if that's not the correct motivation
Mhm.
or why somebody's doing that, or it's more precisely described in other ways, then if we actually want to like have fewer starving children, we shouldn't just we shouldn't just be patronizing towards that lovely event. We should actually
Mhm.
be humble about it and actually ask in a very dispassionate way, what's the best way to characterize what is that person doing and how can we
Mhm.
engage that psychology in future situations in a large scale world where we don't want
Yeah.
kids to starve.
And I think charities and organizations understand psychology in ways maybe uh, with respect to, our psychology of reciprocity and deservingness and
Mm.
interconnectedness, so that, you know, uh, you don't want to say, hey, give $100 to help starving children. You want to say, hey, give $100 to help Rokia, this girl
Right.
who
Yeah.
needs your help. You put a face to it, an individual who is another agent with whom, there can be relationship. Or you like, you put those tiers of giving that communicate sort of status.
Mm.
Uh, but I think making the world more interdependent is always a good thing with respect to willingness to cooperate. One stumbling block is the extent to which, there's this so-called deservingness heuristic, right? That we often won't give when we believe, even if somebody's needy, when we believe they're have put poor little minimal effort into rectifying their situation,
They're lazy and
right?
irresponsible.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
Uh-huh.
I wonder too, like, I mean, those are, but I also wonder to what extent, and I would hope people would have research on this. I mean, it's one thing
Mm,
if you're with that person and you
mhm,
see what they're doing, right? If they're your hunting partner and you see day to
mhm,
day what they're doing versus you experience your higher social class than somebody else.
mhm,
The variation you experience is somebody putting in minimal effort gets to like, 100 units of capital, right? Or like,
mhm,
physical capital. And I see somebody and they have two. So what's a reasonable but probably incorrect
mhm.
inference for that evolved psychology is, well, they're just lazy.
Yeah,
But that's somebody who grew up in or is calibrated for this correlation, right? That may be
mhm.
invalid in a different environment, even if it's physically proximate. It might be there's just a different, there's different amount of social and physical capital across social class divides, for example.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to say that in there's evidence in more egalitarian, smaller scale societies of, purposely, identifiably lazy individuals
Right.
not receiving help.
Yeah.
But I
Mm.
think so there's maybe a reason for this heuristic, delivering this heuristic. Um, but I think the cues we use to identify deservingness in our large scale societies are not aligned with actual deservingness.
Mm,
Uh, we
Mhm.
we underestimate the amount of luck that governs people's
mm,
outcomes in their large scale studies, especially with respect to wealth accrual and all the sort of things you need to gain status in society. It's heavily based on extensive human capital and money. Um,
Mhm. If we're getting it wrong in modern societies in terms of, figuring out whether a recipient deserves help or not, whether they were lazy or not, whether they were irresponsible or not, do you find that we're more likely to get it right in a more ancestral social ecology like the Tsimane?
yeah, just if you're living with a group of people and you observe them often, you'll get to know, you
Yeah.
know, who is failing due to luck versus um, bad luck versus low effort.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
as a
I mean,
result, I mean, people maybe are going to avoid low effort more often.
sure. I mean, I want to flesh out this distinction between low effort versus bad luck.
Mhm.
Because it's not obvious why such a distinction would be an adaptive
Mm,
distinction to make.
mm,
The logic there, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that if this behavior evolved to minimize risk,
mhm,
such that if we're all equally vulnerable to this risk, we can all work together to insure each other against this risk by helping each other out when we suffer it. We all mutually benefit insofar as we can pay a small cost to deliver a large benefit. Assuming that we're equally likely to receive those benefits and pay those costs. If the benefits are larger than the cost, then we all benefit and we all come out ahead in Darwinian terms. But the crucial assumption there is that we're all equally likely to suffer the risk. As soon
mhm,
as you take out that assumption, it no longer necessarily becomes adaptive to participate in this cooperative arrangement. So if it's entirely down to skill, say the only reason why some people have more than others is because they're better at, say, hunting or foraging,
mhm.
then the better hunters and foragers do not necessarily come out ahead in Darwinian terms by sharing with the less productive hunters and foragers. And so
Right.
this distinction between effort versus luck is a very sensible distinction to make if you're trying to calibrate altruistic behavior towards situations where it is likely to pay off in Darwinian terms compared to situations where it is not likely to pay off. Do you buy that logic?
Yeah, I mean, why do good hunters share?
Hmm.
Is why should they do that if um, they're doing generally better? And I think uh, to the extent that good hunters themselves don't suffer similar levels of risk, even if they are slightly better hunters than the next person. Yeah, just in terms of risk reduction, there's less motive to engage in sharing or aiding those with less than them, regardless of, whether those with less was a result of bad luck or low effort. I don't know if
Mm.
that's part of what you're driving at. That distinction doesn't matter if you have more, why share at all? Regardless of whether the person that has less is a result of bad luck or low effort. Um, in that case, they're beyond risk reduction. There are benefits to status gain and developing a
Mm.
reputation through signaling or through partner choice of
Yes.
your commitment to others. So that's
Yes.
one way out of that.
Hmm.
Uh, so
Can I push on
yeah,
one thing too? Just
yeah,
but there's also like kids and old people, right? I mean, there's also this thing of like I know how much a kid can do. I know how
hmm
much like my grandparents can do.
hmm
So there's presumably some understanding of it's not that the person who used to be a good hunter who's now old and can't hunt at their old level, it's not
hmm
that they're unlucky for the last 20 years, right? It's that their competence has changed, right? And likewise for the kids for different reasons.
hmm
How, the idea of luck and laziness already assumes kind of accounting for those differences. How do you understand those differences being accounted for?
Well, mentioned older people whose productivity declines are not necessarily due to low effort, right? But
Or they
change in
might
ability.
benefit other ways, right? Like maybe
Yeah.
that's part of the answer, right? Is they're providing
Mhm.
other things like alloparenting knowledge,
They
skills,
are.
social skills, right? So it's
Yeah.
multidimensional, but we're using hunting as an example. So yeah, sorry.
But while, I think older people are often receive respect, the oldest people um, are often, there's social networks decline in size. From work we've done with the Tsimane, found that older individuals can suffer increased anxiety and depression given their fears about their low productivity and decreasing value to others.
Mm,
Um, so yeah, so their ability to engage in sharing based principally on reciprocity, is declined. It's not to say they're not recipients of aid that's motivated by other reasons, kinship,
Hmm.
side signaling, whatever. Um, uh, so yeah, I think that this is another misnomer that the oldest people in traditional societies are the most respected, highest status people. Older, but not the oldest, has been
mm,
my experience in my reading in various ethnographies. I mean, there are exceptions where the oldest, yeah, retain high levels of respect, but I think as productivity wanes, and your ability to be mobile wanes, then your status declines. Um, so yeah,
Interesting.
and these aren't, the oldest of the old aren't leading community meetings. They're not in a lot of more traditional societies.
Yeah. There's also a political dimension to this that I've been interested in lately, where this
Mm,
distinction between bad luck versus low effort or low productivity or whatever is
mm,
also extremely politically relevant if there are conflicts over who deserves resources and who doesn't.
mm,
And your attributions about bad luck versus low effort can be hugely biased by your allegiances to the person in question. So if
mm,
it's my brother or my ally and they have, low access to resources, not enough food,
mm,
whatever, I'm going to be more motivated to say it was bad luck. But if it was my enemy or my rival, then I'm going to say, oh, he's lazy, he's irresponsible. And so there are these political considerations as well that shift how you interpret the situation and how political coalitions can gain more resources for themselves while excluding rivals from valued resources by exploiting this part of our psychology. Do you
mm.
buy this idea that this distinction between bad luck and low effort is a political weapon? And do you see any examples of that in the Chimane?
I see examples of that every day in my life, I think.
Wow. Okay.
So yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I know I've enjoyed your recent pieces on coalitional kind of
Hmm.
coalitional psychology driving our politics in a lot of ways. And
Hmm.
um, yeah, yeah, certainly framing of deservingness based on alliances, political repercussions. Oh yeah, I think that's in any part of the politics of any society,
Cool.
um,
Wow.
and including the Chimane. I've done some work on alliances there,
Hmm.
um, and who forms alliances with whom, and it's often based on past relationships and who mutual enemies and things like that. And sort of based on a triadic kind of understanding the way that Dave himself has modeled these things too.
Hmm.
We'll pay you after
But
this, Chris. Thank you.
yeah, I'm trying
You're right.
to, yeah. But what this also occurred to me. I don't know, maybe this is sort of a left field, but the philosopher sort of government, political science, uh, Harvard professor Sandel, I think, has written, among others, has discussed the idea that everything is luck in
Mm,
some ways, and that you're
Hmm.
born in the right place with the right
yeah.
genes. And so to talk about
Yeah.
even low effort as somehow not a product of luck, I mean, what isn't a product of luck? So that might be an
Right.
extreme. It's part of his attack on meritocracy, and I wanted to claim who
Hmm.
deserves what.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think in these smaller scale, more egalitarian societies, distribution is maybe um, least meritocratic in the
Hmm.
sense of like going towards those typically need because most people are in need most of the time. And so it's not just privileging those that, are the best, hardest workers get the most. Um,
Hmm. I'm wondering if maybe this luck versus low effort is the wrong way to think of it,
mm,
because it's not necessarily luck per se. Really, the distinction that we should have evolved to care about from an evolutionary perspective is is there variation in susceptibility to this risk? So
mhm,
if there's no variation and we're all equally susceptible to it, then that's a situation where reciprocal altruism is going to pay off. But
mm,
if there is inequality in our susceptibility to this risk,
mhm,
then it no longer pays off as much, or at least as straightforwardly, for the people who are at reduced susceptibility for the risk to give to the people who are higher susceptibility to the
right.
risk. So really, what we should be focusing on is variation in vulnerability to this shortfall rather than luck per se. I mean, it sort of translates to luck when you think about it, but when you start to think about how genes themselves are a kind of luck, then this logic starts to fall apart, and maybe it's a more fruitful way to think about this in terms of variation in risk susceptibility. Do you think that's a better way to think about it?
Yeah, I would think that wouldn't you predict where there's greater variation across individuals and their susceptibility to risk, you'd expect more reciprocity because you'd want to especially then figure out who's going to be a more reliable partner based on higher risk, lower risk profile, right? Whereas if people have similar levels of risk, there's less need to engage in reciprocity, direct reciprocity per se. Um,
Yeah, there's also
give
this complication. Sorry, Chris. I just like there's
Yeah.
this complication too of like the risky things, like the distribution of high packets of high value are just
Mm,
more distributed, just clumpier, right? Like in
mm,
the world, like
Hmm.
air, we don't
Right.
consider like air high value because it's just everywhere. I mean, unless you're, in space, and then it is actually a high variance thing. But um, so even the idea of sort of what counts as high variance is not even just attached to an individual per se. I mean, it can be, but it's
mm,
also, this is classically the idea of low variance resources, like the things you can just like dig up a tuber, those
right,
are not shared. But
right,
high
right.
variance things like meat are, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
So
mean,
yes, I'm not so much thinking about the clumpiness of the resource. So just to give a concrete example, let's
mm,
say we all are vulnerable to this problem of our homes collapsing. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that that is entirely a product of how good of a craftsman you are and when you're building your home. If you're a good craftsman, your home's not going to collapse. If you're bad at building homes, if you're careless or stupid or whatever, your home is more likely to collapse. In that case, it doesn't necessarily benefit the good craftsman to help the bad craftsman, right? But if your home collapsing is entirely a product of luck or a luck that we're all equally likely to experience, say, a
mm.
storm or bad weather conditions or whatever, then it creates the situation where we want to create a reciprocal altruistic arrangement.
Okay. Based on that anecdote, yes, I can see that, see the logic there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Although David, and then
Yeah.
Chris,
Yeah.
but also maybe the home builder does build there and says, "Hey, let me actually help you next time," because then that other person, did,
Yeah.
that's the prestige, right? Where it's sort of like
Right. Yeah.
that person who's not very good at building homes. If like let's say I'm the incompetent home builder, I don't want my home to
Right.
collapse on my kid and hurt them. So it's
Yeah.
actually I intrinsically value you because you've helped me, and
Right.
then I'm willing to. So you can also then as long as you helping me, the incompetent one, is conditional on me ratcheting up some benefit in return, then
Hmm.
it becomes a
Yeah.
reciprocity thing, right? Where I'm conferring more status to you, more benefits to you, I'm indebted to you, I want to return in maybe not in kind. Maybe there's things I'm better at than you, or maybe I can just help you out in other ways.
Hmm.
So it's exactly right that I think if you look just across the commodity, if you just hold constant and just say building houses, it's not in the best home builders' interest to help the poor home
Hmm.
builders. But if you add, there's actually multiple currencies in
Yes.
the world, and you're tracking whether or not the indebtedness or reciprocity is is possible and
Yes.
happening, then you
Right.
can see where that would open up, and it would be uh, really good for me to represent. You're actually better than me. Hey, David, please help me build my home. That's
Yeah.
awesome. And I'm
Yeah.
super happy to do it because you can do better than I can do.
Right.
Then you start to get this market or this division of labor, right?
Right. Yeah, no, I totally buy that. So
Mhm.
the argument is that direct reciprocity for the specific good or service being provided. So that I help you with repair your home if it collapses, you help me repair my home if it collapses. If my home is not going to collapse and yours is, then that arrangement doesn't benefit me
Right,
at all.
right, right.
But indirect reciprocity could still evolve, where I help you repair your home and I get some other benefit in return, maybe high status for being a good
Mhm.
craftsman or whatever. So the argument applies to direct reciprocity rather than indirect reciprocity.
And there's a lot of great work on how those different currencies matter more or less as the socioecology changes.
Hmm.
So in very mobile hunter-gatherers, actually there seems to be greater evidence of demand sharing, um, and where you're sharing based upon diminishing returns to hoarding a resource that you've just captured. The signal reciprocity is stronger where people are congregating in camps together for longer periods of time. There's opportunity to sort of have over time reciprocity with particular individuals. Um, as societies get more material wealth, the sort of signaling of personal ability becomes a much larger sort of motive than
Hmm.
reciprocity. As individual wealth diminishes the need to insure against risk through social relationships,
Hmm.
then you get a lot of sharing as sort of demonstration of skill or ability or whatever, or
Hmm.
competitiveness. Um,
Interesting.
so yeah, the way these different motives for sharing as they relate to risk shift with the ecology in these kinds of ways. The ability to, first of all, what's the nature of the risk is declining or going up, and how is that risk can it be mitigated through means other than social relationships? And also, what's the opportunity to develop reciprocity with particular people over time?
Hmm.
Is there
That's
any
fascinating.
work? Is there any work like there's been like this long history of political science that's sort of
Mhm.
implicitly assumed things about this psychology. Is there any ethnographically informed political science from your perspective, or is this what the book that you need to write? I mean, I don't want to oversimplify or over characterize an entire field. I'm
Mhm.
sure there is, but I mean, in your perspective, have you looked into this literature or talked to people?
Uh, the political science of smaller scale societies generally.
Or just, I mean,
Like,
even, even just sort of people being like, well, let's like, how do we build a more just, fair society?
mhm.
Like that is often implicitly like the overriding goal of a lot of political theory.
Oh, yeah.
And,
Yeah.
a lot of that implicitly appeals to, well, what are the motivations of people? Or, what you're describing is it's
Mhm.
complicated, right? Like, what's the resource?
Mhm.
And how do you, so if there are people who want to respect the complexity of it and understand how the system works, to then say, for example, like, how do we encourage people to like create a society where people aren't starving or have all the medical care they need?
Yeah.
Is there work that's sort of bridging those two areas, or is that not yet happening?
No, I think there are a number of political scientists that have been interested in the work that like evolutionary anthropologists have done in sort of evolutionary motives for giving, and then have tried to leverage that to understand why um, you know policies succeed or fail, or institutions succeed or fail at a in a large scale society setting.
Mm,
Like Michael Van Peterson,
Hmm.
somebody that we know
Yep.
uh, that has commented on this kind of thing with regard to the sort of deservingness heuristic and people's views about welfare. Um, I think one thing our institutions, this is something Joe Henrik has written a lot about, is and done, sort of experimental games in different societies to that he argues are consistent with this point, is that we've generated institutions that increase trust among strangers. And that's one thing that we talk about the generosity and its motives in terms of risk reduction or um, in terms of demand sharing or signaling in these smaller scale societies. But in the context of experiments, members of these societies are often the least likely to give to an anonymous other. And, Henrik argues it's our exposure to institutions that, create rule of law and sort of reduce transaction costs with strangers that, mean in some ways we're at least with anonymous strangers who may not meet that often, in practice, we're more likely to be generous than are members of these more egalitarian societies.
right. So
Um,
the idea is that like an anonymous other, that's when you're growing up in a world where you know everybody, then if it's an anonymous other, you're going to have you have no idea. Yeah, it might be a low trust, whatever. But in the idea is that there's certain
yeah.
institutions that do a better or worse job. I can say living in Northern Europe versus the US, Northern Europe
Mhm.
does much better. Like I'm
Mhm.
like, I feel like part of my reverse culture shock is I'm feeling a less trusty common norm than in Northern Europe.
Yeah.
So I'm feeling that right now. I'm sort of recalibrating to US versus Northern Europe on that.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Good example of evoked culture happening
Yeah,
inside your head.
exactly. Yes, no, exactly. I'm like, yeah. Chris, we often ask people how they got interested in evolutionary social sciences.
Mm. Mm.
Did you have we've kind of quote unquote call these people's origin stories because sometimes people had, sort of a journey to find it.
Mhm.
For you, how did you get into this?
I was a history major at first in college,
Mm,
and I liked the classes, great teachers, but we're learning about the fall of Constantinople, whatever it becomes this, then uh, among other things. And it's like, well, why? Why do humans engage in warfare generally? Why are we so tied to symbols? And why do those motivate war? Just to pick an example. So
Mhm.
extrapolating out those larger questions about human behavior just seemed missing from the history classes I was taking. Um, and I'd also been interested in biology in high school, especially, and I was sort of unsure what direction I'd take in college and went the history route. And then one day, I was with my roommate leafing through the course catalog and came across biological anthropology, and it was like primates and like Frank Marlowe, who'd worked with the Hadza, was part of the department there at the time, and you could do paleogenomics and all kinds of things that sort of collectively helped tools to help us understand human origins and the evolution of our behavior and psychology. Uh, and I was like, wow, this is it. And then like I think I had read at the time was reading Gun Germs and Steel, sort of that like gateway drug for a lot of people to this area by Jared Diamond and Steven Pinker, uh, How the Mind Works. So yeah, so I switched to that as an undergrad. I wasn't sure I was going to go to grad school. I started off looking into like environmental consulting kinds of jobs after I graduated from college, but I kept reading in the area. Um, and then also because this is a story I tell myself, but Santa Barbara continued to be on my mind for a couple of reasons. One was that it was mentioned to me when I'd read, I think it was Matt Riley's Origins of Virtue for a course in college, and Tubi and
Mhm.
Cosmides came up. I'm like, what? This sort of discussions from their work was just fascinating to me. Um, and they were at Santa Barbara. And then I also remember in high school, my guidance counselor's office, we had like VHS tapes that were promo videos for different colleges. And I remember the Santa Barbara one had people like on the beach coming in from surfing.
yes,
Uh, so I was like,
it doesn't hurt.
check.
Yeah.
Doesn't, yeah, yeah. Good
East
environment.
Coast winter, yeah, you're
Oh
like, yeah,
yeah.
no, yeah, Boston, yeah.
So I was like, you know what, let's apply there. And I didn't know Mike Gervin really, he was just starting out there. But that was tended, ended up being just such a benefit coming into the beginning of that major project he started with the Chimane. So that's where my sort of trajectory is yeah.
Yeah.
Wanting to know the big
Cool.
stories about humans and wanting the bigger explanations, despite the reductionism, that's sort of the area which the land in which I love to operate. Love
Yeah,
the details too, but the larger stories are more appealing to me.
yeah, it is a common thread I've noticed that people are constantly bringing up the need to ask why. Why? My daughter is at the stage of her development where she asks me why, until I
Yeah,
get down to
yeah,
like the basics of metaphysics and ontology.
yeah,
But I think what I'm starting to see is that an evolutionary psychologist is someone who just never turned off that childhood part of themselves, where they still just retain this need to know why, and just drill down to the basics.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's
yeah,
what I love about it. It goes all the way down to, the second law of thermodynamics, as, John Tooby, uh, insightfully wrote.
hmm
It's, evolution is the only anti-entropic, force, that guides organisms toward adaptive complexity that we know of. And it's a really deep and satisfying way of seeing the world. Um,
yeah. I think proximate questions are fantastic. I mean, in a sense, that's what evolutionary psychology does do is answer
yeah.
proximate questions about mechanism, right?
hmm
But without the larger motivating ultimate questions, there's no spark in it for me.
Yeah,
Uh,
totally.
so
Cool.
yeah,
So, one last thing. I remember we were having an email exchange about some of these ideas a while ago. I forget when it was, and you had
yeah.
mentioned this really interesting distinction between what you called superlative status, and I forget what the alternative was. It was like uh, not being. So I guess it's the difference between being better than other people and not being worse than other people.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
which is I think of it as sort of offensive status versus defensive status.
Mm,
You know, like I'm trying to be better than you versus I'm trying to defend myself from being a pariah.
yeah.
Um, and so far as I'm aware, like there's not a lot of research on this distinction. Uh, and I think it's a really important one and of huge evolutionary significance because I would expect the defensive version of it to have exerted a stronger selection pressure
Mm,
on our ancestors than the offensive version of it. Just because the slope of fitness has diminishing returns, so if you're going to go down the go backwards, you're going to have a steeper drop in fitness than if you go forward up the plateau of diminishing returns. So fitness costs should loom larger than fitness benefits.
yeah.
And you would
Yeah.
expect people to be more paranoid about being seen as a bad person than they are motivated to be seen as a good person. And I think a lot of altruism
Mm,
psychologically is motivated by the fear of being seen as a bad person compared to the positive desire to be seen as morally superior.
yeah.
Even the this so Peter Singer makes this classic argument that if you see a child drowning in a pond, would you wade in to save the drowning child and ruin your fancy $1,000 suit? And most people say, yeah, of course. You can get a new suit, but it's worth it to save the child. But then he poses the counterfactual: why don't you donate $1,000 to Oxfam to save children from starvation or malaria or whatever?
Yeah.
Um, and I think the reason why this argument is effective is because it makes us seem like the sociopath who would refuse to rescue
Mm,
the drowning child to save their fancy suit. It's not that it motivates you to be a good person, is that it elicits this fear in you that you're a bad person, that you're that sociopath who doesn't save the child.
right.
And so I think this fear of being a bad person is really powerful psychologically. It's understudied, and I'm curious. So you have this paper measuring, reproductive success and its correlation with status.
Mm,
So far as I'm aware, that paper doesn't measure the negative dimensions of status. It, measures, political influence, but it doesn't measure the extent to which you're a social pariah, or whether you're excluded, or whether you're the hunter who hunts too much and becomes a social outcast.
yeah.
But I would suspect that if you included that negative dimension of status, the correlation with fitness would be much higher. Do you share that intuition?
Yeah, I mean, it's great you brought that up. I think I'm myself, I've devoted too little attention to the sort of bottom half of the distribution, or even the bottom 75% of the distribution of status
Hmm.
relative to the top 25%.
Yeah.
Um, and it's probably a bigger motive for us to avoid being at the bottom
Hmm.
than it is necessarily to reach the top. Like, yeah, if we reach the top, that's amazing, but definitely
Hmm.
do not reach the bottom. That's
Hmm.
strike out. Uh,
Yeah.
and maybe that accords with sort of risk profiles where people are riskiest at the bottom and at the top, but most of the middle of the hierarchy, people are more risk averse because they don't want to
Yeah.
slide down to the bottom.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I don't know. I think with regard to reproduction, I know in modern industrialized societies, the relationship that still exists between like income and reproduction in men is almost entirely driven from lots of studies by childless men who just never reproduce.
Hmm. Interesting.
So it's not driven by men at the top having a lot more kids, which there is a small effect of that still with respect to income, but nothing like what drives that relationship is more the childless men at the bottom. In the societies like the smaller scale societies like the Tsimane, there's very fewer men that strike out. I think, and there is uh, although that's still part of the equation, I think there is a bigger signal of reproduction at the top end, um,
Hmm.
in terms of those with more influence, more likely to be polygynous or marry serially,
Hmm.
or have better child survival. Um, but clear, yeah, I would bet across all human societies, yeah, that striking out is the bigger motive. So I mean, arguably, our status psychology evolved more even to avoid the bottom than to hit the top, just as you're saying. But it's not
Hmm.
something I've devoted much attention to and probably should more. So
Yeah, it's
thanks for bringing that up to me. I'm going to think more about it again now that you brought it up
yeah.
again.
Please do. It seems like a really underappreciated thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Wonder if there's
yeah.
developmental, I mean, because I keep thinking about like gym class or school, like that's such a,
Hmm.
any kid when we were all kids, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like, that's like the super salient. Just, not being the pariah or not being the kid
Yeah.
that's picked on. And then the
Yeah.
kid who is, that's a real, you've got to figure out, you got to be funny or you've got to figure out another way to survive. I mean, that's a really, John Tooby always said, the right way to think about human social life, if you're not like Chris and working with folks who have a more ecologically valid, quote unquote, existence,
Hmm.
it's more like high school or junior high or elementary school,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
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 This made me think too. Oh, go ahead,
No, go ahead.
David. I was just thinking of the, asymmetric war of attrition is sort of based on the you're going to want to minimize the cost of continued competition. And so it's better to sort of, rather than potentially, you know, make the best of a bad deal, don't end up at the bottom, but don't necessarily shoot for the top if it's gonna hurt you over the longer run. Costs outweigh the benefits. I think a lot of people will accept somewhat subordinate positions as long as they're not the very bottom
Mm.
Hmm.
in human
Oh yeah,
societies.
that's a really good point. Yeah,
Uh,
a lot of people going along with very dominant totalitarianism, for example,
mhm.
just because they're the second bottom rung, right? Where, like
Yeah,
poor whites in the South or um,
yeah. Yeah.
people in, Europe during the Third Reich coming in. And, if you're not the victim and you're still okay, you'll go along with the regime, sort of, yeah, is the
Hmm.
idea. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I find this really interesting. I also suspect that there's interesting individual differences
Mm.
related to the question of how motivated you are to be at the top versus avoid being at the bottom.
Mm.
So I have the intuition that if you're really concerned with being at the top and being better than other people, that you're kind of a dick. That like you're kind of a mean competitive person. Whereas if you're primarily motivated by avoiding being at the bottom, you're not necessarily a bad person. That's just kind of understandable. So that's another question that I'm curious about, and I find that this comes up in discussions of the role of signaling in human behavior. So
Mhm.
I am of the opinion that signaling plays a pervasive role in human social life and is the explanation for a lot of our behaviors, even when we would not want to admit that it is the explanation for our behavior. But I find that a lot of people are turned off by this because they see it as cynical.
Yeah.
But I think the cynicism is coming from an interpretation that the signal is offensive in nature, that the signal is to try to display my superiority to others. But I think a lot of the times the signal is defensive. It's trying to prevent others from seeing you as worse or inferior to
Mm.
others. And as soon as you see these signaling motives as being really more about defensive motives than offensive motives, it becomes less cynical and it becomes more of a plausible
Mm.
theoretical framework from which to view human behavior that, really it is a lot about signaling, but we just have to recognize that a lot of those signals are defensive in nature.
Mm. I think we treat sort of punching down the same though, no matter where somebody is on the hierarchy, I think, right? So even if it is
Hmm.
defensive, if you're like second from the bottom, hitting the bottom rung to not get down to the bottom rung, do we see that as bad as the person at the top punching down the person at the bottom? I think they're
That's an
both seen
interesting.
as, um, but individual differences in the sort of propensity for this that you raised, yeah. Uh, I think maybe things related to neuroticism, sort of personality variation, where we're going to be much more focused on avoiding the bottom,
Mhm.
which would preclude taking risks that might get us to the top.
Yeah,
Or yeah, but I think that's
right.
yeah.
I mean, and there's also, I mean, an aspect of this where is if you're a male, and we know that variance in reproductive success is higher among males than
Mhm.
females, and likely
Mhm.
was ancestrally. If you see yourself as being at the bottom, as being
Mhm.
doomed to reproductive oblivion, then you're in a really dangerous place for the rest of the people around you because you have nothing to lose.
Mhm.
You can take dangerous risks, take other people down with you, like from a Darwinian perspective, you can run amok. And so I suspect a lot of the most vile attacks we see are from men with nothing to lose who see themselves as at the bottom, or groups
Yeah.
of people who see themselves as at the bottom and don't see a way out from that
Yeah.
position. Those people are going to be really dangerous to society.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think like Martin Daly, Margot Wilson's work on, the male, what is it they call it? The young male syndrome,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
But it's particularly young men who are find themselves in positions of low status within a high inequality hierarchy.
Hmm.
Um, and there's one recent work by this guy, Pat Barclay and Misha. I don't know, I forget his full name. Might have been a student with Pat or a collaborator on
Oh
sort of
yeah.
risk sensitivity with respect to
Yeah.
status position,
Yeah,
and
we have
its
to have Pat
relationship
on.
to,
Yeah.
yeah, just what you're describing. Um, or broader, in a broader sense, when you have sort of political elites mobilizing that group of people, and mobilizing their anger for their
Yeah.
ends.
Mm.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yes. Yep. Forming alliances with them. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah,
It's a
Which is
sticky
completely
representation. Yeah.
yeah, for sure.
yeah.
Um, yeah, no, there's some other work I'm loosely familiar with it called last place aversion,
Hmm.
where we have an aversion to being in last place in a competition, much more so than any other position in the totem pole. And
Hmm.
I remember reading that they were looking at attitudes toward the minimum wage, and it was people who were
Oh yeah.
right above the minimum wage who opposed raising the minimum wage because it would put them in last
Mm.
place. Um,
Hmm.
so I don't know if that paper, I haven't looked into like the data analytics of it or whether that holds up, but it's an interesting idea that this could potentially be, explains some variation in our political attitudes.
Right, that it's not just the wealthiest who are opposed to welfare, but those, given that our most salient comparisons are those in our sort of local status net, sort of social networks,
Yeah.
status relevant social networks.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, who's that? I think Michael Norton, Harvard Business School, but he wasn't the main author. Uh, did the paper on this that those just above the poverty line, you see an uptick in anti-welfare views because
Mm.
it's giving a handout to the people right below them down the
Mm.
street.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think
Yeah.
it really explains a lot about the dynamics of political coalitions, particularly in the United States, and why we see this divide between ethnic subgroups of within the lower class, where you
Yeah.
see low
Yeah.
status white Americans predominantly shifting toward the Republican coalition, and low status ethnic minorities predominantly shifting towards the Democratic coalition. I think those status conflicts, I think, are a major driver
Mhm.
of political alliances, and obviously political elites try to exploit that in various ways, often successfully.
Well, I think the whole immigration dialogue and debate in the US and in other countries recently, but in the US, that's been uh, appealing to a lot of minority communities, including the sort of Latino community that I know I have a lot of friends Latino friends who are, first, second generation immigrants, but have some conservative views with respect to illegal immigrants,
Mm.
that
Hmm.
might be shaped in part by this sort of, they don't get to sort of leapfrog me kind of view, which
Mm.
is, uh,
Yeah.
so, it's, uh, I think there are minority communities that are, have the reasons similar to the theory we're articulating here for being anti, um, welfare to the lowest rungs on the ladder.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. When Chris, when you're when you're in with the Chimane versus you come back to Virginia,
Uh-huh.
is there anything that's pops out to you? Like, because not all of us get to experience this. What is it like switching back and forth? And,
Mhm.
what is it like?
I think the main thing is supermarkets. I
Yeah.
mean, holy crap. Like, assembling that much dense caloric stuff in one place that's like been produced all over the world
Yeah.
is, oh my God. Yeah. That's like, I think is typically the big thing that gets me.
Mm.
Uh, I'm a very food motivated person. I think, we
We
all
all
are.
are. No,
We all are,
totally.
but
Yeah, yeah.
um, yeah,
No, it's food is everything. If you don't have food,
yeah.
good
Oh,
luck
this
doing
was
anything
interesting.
else.
I had um a student in Bolivia who I've been sponsoring came to the United States to be part of this workshop, this indigenous leadership workshop. And he, he's Chamane, and got him a visa. He's able to come to the United States. And I picked him up in DC. And I remember the first thing he's thought when he saw coming here was he thought that our land was on fire because it was autumn and the tree leaves were
Mm.
turning
Oh,
color.
interesting. Oh, that's so
And that
cool.
was
I
like,
mean, yeah,
so coming back, just the vegetation is,
yeah.
you know, the sort of what trees. I always on the lookout. The Amazon is, trees are not always your friends.
Mm. Because
Uh,
of animals and insects
Spines and
and the plants
poisons and
themselves. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, we have to have Annie worts on. Yeah.
yeah. And there are, animals that live commensally with the ants and others of the trees that act as their defense mechanisms. And
Yeah.
uh, it's more of like in parts of the, being the Amazon, it's so much many more surprises around the next corner of different animals and things. And but you got to be on your toes. So,
Have you had any interesting animal encounter stories?
oh, like living with bats in the hut out I would stay in. I came across jaguar footprints, never encountered one directly, thankfully. Came across a python, or not a python, a raptor, it's called a bushmaster, highly venomous snake.
Mm.
Ooh.
Uh, and
David's
yeah,
face. David's face.
Yeah, one of the many reasons I'm not cut out for field work.
yeah,
I'm like a midpoint because I'll go like backpacking and stuff, especially before having children. But
yeah,
yeah, no, that's a whole other level. Yeah.
yeah. But
Yeah.
one of the more like dangerous things I was doing was part of this project. We are measuring tree circumferences and species with Tsimane people who are cutting down trees for places to grow their crops. And
Hmm.
we're interested in sort of like how they expend energy over time in doing this and how often they take rests. And uh, and we had sort of heart rate monitors they were using, and I would go in and measure tree circumferences, and then they were using axes to chop these trees down. But the older the Chimani person, the more skilled they were. So they wouldn't just go after every tree with like machismo, but like carefully
Mm.
go after this one tree, look around, look where the vines are connecting trees, go to another tree that seems like totally far away, cut that one. It would be sufficient to like bring all the trees down from just a minority of them cut because they're all connected through vines. Right. But
Hmm.
when I'd be following an older individual doing this that was more strategic, I wouldn't know where the trees were going to come from when they started falling. And you have to
Ah.
like get out of their way fast. So that
Smarter,
was
not
Wow.
that was some
harder.
more,
That's smarter, not
yeah,
harder.
yeah,
That's yeah.
Indiana Jones here, jumping away from falling trees and venomous
yeah.
snakes.
I love
Well, I like
that.
that story. It
Yeah, yeah,
signals my sort of, you know, my
yeah.
medal for being able to do that. But I mean, but also that it showcases the role of skill acquisition
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
for them.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I mean, yeah, I think every anthropologist I've talked to has a story like that where even the kids in the community will just be like, "Come on!" Like I think Sheena
mhm,
Levy talked about that. We're just
mhm,
like, yeah, we're all. Sometimes people say things like I don't know if this is still a thing that's said, but people say like, well, the human mind is more complicated than it needs to be for like hunter gatherer or
oh gosh.
foraging. Like, yeah, exactly. And it's like, what? Like,
Yeah, yeah,
have you tried to like, yeah, exactly. I mean, and I think that comes from this place
yeah.
of sort of this great chain of cultural being, right? Where sort of
Mm,
it's like
mm,
primitive and it's
yeah,
simple, and
yeah,
how hard could it be?
yeah,
And I just love that there's all these stories of Chris is trying to avoid trees falling on him, and
oh
the
yeah,
guys are like, "Come on, Chris."
yeah. You gotta, listen to the local people, especially ones that lived there a while. They know what's going on.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Well, the tree of time is about to fall on us. We're approaching two
Y-
hours now.
Yeah, and we
Okay.
we always have one question, which is, is there any question we should have asked you?
Oh, I think we've covered a fair bit of ground. I knew you wanted to talk about egalitarianism in some
Yeah,
way today, and
I think we hit that. I
we
mean,
hit
yeah,
that, yeah.
yeah.
Uh, but no, my secret
I mean,
exploits at UCSB as a grad student, we didn't cover that, but that's good. That's not,
Okay, good.
I mean,
We
uh,
can
we
can
didn't
be an
really talk
appendix in
about
your book. Yeah.
we didn't
uh,
really talk about leadership. I feel like that's a huge. Maybe we'll have to bring you
Mm.
on again and really get into leadership. Uh,
sure, sure.
uh,
How
yeah.
we, how and why we romanticize it. How much does it matter? Are
Hmm.
good questions, I think, to ask. But yeah,
Super
Yeah.
cool. But Chris, you are so you're at University of Richmond, Jepson School of Leadership, and people can find you on your website. And
get Google Chris Von Rueden. I have my sort of school website. I also have a Google site that I curate occasionally with like videos and publications and things up there. So
awesome. And in
data sets and
Tsimane, people who are interested in finding more about Tsimane, like what resources are for that?
for the Tsimane, again, they've been the subject of a lot of research, everything from like their musical performance and
Oh,
musical
cool.
cognition to health, a lot of work on health. And so if you Google the Tsimane Health and Life History Project, you'll see information. But there's lots of work done with the Tsimane, including by the Tsimane themselves, who have made some uh, documentaries about their way of life. Some of which you can find posted on like YouTube and
Oh, cool. And it
um,
starts with a T.
yeah,
Tsimane starts with a T.
Tsimane. It's also been spelled Chiman.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, David, do you have anything else?
No, I think that about does it. This was a really fun conversation. Thanks for talking to us, Chris.
Yeah,
Oh, to
it was great. Yeah, we'll have to have you back on for leadership or for tree felling.
Yeah.
totally, yeah, totally happy to talk you through the yeah scale of tree felling. Sure.
Sorry.
Uh, well, here we are at the end of the episode. Thank you for listening. If you like what you're hearing, please don't be shy. Tell people about it on social media. Shout it from the mountaintops. We're a new podcast. We're trying to build an audience and gain support for what we're doing. And where can people support us, Dave?
Well, they can support us emotionally however they want, but in terms of
Hmm.
behaviorally, they can sort of leave a good review.
Hmm.
They can support us on Patreon. And yeah, just listening, liking, subscribing, and leaving reviews, that are neutral to positive is certainly helpful.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
All
If
right.
you feel that way, if you feel like you feel negatively about it,
Yeah.
I'll leave that
If
to
you
your
hate us, yeah.
discretion. Yeah.
Yeah. If you hate us, you could send us hate mail too. But
I would not.
maybe no, maybe not hate
Well,
mail.
no, if you hate us, just think about why you hate us and maybe think about something more productive you could do with your time.
Yeah. If you have nothing nice to say, then don't say it at all.
I think that's a good rules to live by. So, but
Yeah. Okay.
you take that with a grain of salt. So,
Mhm.
but yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.